Welcome everyone. Welcome to Volunteering Victoria's webinar series. Making sure volunteers of all backgrounds and identities feel welcome and included in our organisations is a key role for volunteer managers. Today, I'm going to be talking to Daniel Bryan from Thorne Harbour Health and Ada Castle from Switchboard about their experience in working with the LGBTIQ+ volunteers. Daniel and Ada will share their experience of the barriers to inclusion that this volunteer group can face and how organisations can build a more inclusive environment for LGBTIQ+ volunteers. So I've just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our two guests. So in the interest of all the other listeners, please keep yourself on mute throughout the webinar. You should have arrived on mute, but you will be able to check by hovering your mouse over the screen and checking that the mute button is clicked. There's a public chat box which will send messages of hellos to all participants. So feel free to introduce yourself, but if you have a question, we'd ask that you submit it through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll raise it with presenters at the end of the webinar. If you're having technical troubles, please use the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll try and assist you with the technology. This webinar will also be able to stream via Volunteering Victoria's website a few days after today. Before we go on, I'd also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that I'm presenting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I know that being in socially distanced spaces means that we might not all be logging on from the same traditional country, so feel free to acknowledge the traditional custodians where you are in the chat box. So now, without further ado, let me introduce my two guests, Ada and Daniel. So Ada Castle, whose pronouns are she, her, is the Out and About Program Manager at Switchboard Victoria, a not-for-profit organisation run by and for LGBTIQA+ people. Out and About is a volunteer-driven visiting and friendship service for socially isolated LGBTIQA+ seniors living with a disability or chronic health conditions. Ada has over 15 years' experience working and volunteering within the LGBTIQA+ communities, formal training in public health and gender studies, and is passionate about access and inclusion. Hi, Ada. So Daniel leads a large and diverse team of socially progressive volunteers at Thorne Harbour Health, formerly the Victorian AIDS Council, who support PLHIV, so people living with HIV, and the wider LGBTIQ communities. The program was established in response to the HIV epidemic and continues to have volunteers involved in the direct delivery of services, as well as support roles, including a very busy events team, which I imagine is currently on hold. A passionate advocate for volunteerism within marginalised communities and proud history of activism and support for HIV and marriage equality campaigns. As an openly gay man living with HIV, Daniel finds time to volunteer with Living Positive Victoria to facilitate workshops for newly diagnosed PLHIV, so people living with HIV, and enjoys volunteering with the Melbourne Queer Film Festival, which I believe has actually just finished up for another year. Daniel's excited to lead the establishment of the first LGBTIQ volunteer resource hub. So welcome, Daniel and Ada, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Sarah, and it's really good to have lots of people in the audience as well.
Hi, thanks so much. So lovely to be here. Thank
you. So before we get into today's topic about building an inclusive volunteer program and all of the aspects and facets of that, I do always like in these webinars to get to know our presenters a little bit. So Ada, are you happy to tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Absolutely, and thanks again for having me on board today, and a big hello to everyone joining us. So yes, my name's Ada and I use she, her pronouns, and I work at Switchboard Victoria. I currently run our LGBTI community visitors scheme at Switchboard Victoria. And hello to my colleagues joining in from the community visitors scheme today. And I connect with and support socially isolated older LGBTIQA+ or LGBTI, and we'll speak a bit about that difference in a moment. People right across Victoria. I also undertake all aspects of volunteer management with 65 volunteers from ages 21 to 85 right across the state, and support them to connect and visit socially isolated older people. I myself am a bisexual woman, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today.
Fantastic. So Daniel, do you want to jump in and tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm Daniel Bryan and my pronouns are he, him. I've been volunteer and student coordinator at Thorne Harbour Health for the past 5 years, but been connected as a member and a volunteer with Thorne Harbour Health for 11 years. We've got a core group of around 250 volunteers doing more traditional, a weekly volunteering, and a 900 strong volunteer pool who are ready to assist with events, episodic volunteering, and project work. And in addition to that, we have a lot of corporate volunteering happening, and largely with links to pride and diversity networks at our corporate partners. It's fair to say that most of our volunteers would identify as LGBTI, but it's also important to acknowledge that we have a lot of allies who work within the organisation, and in particular, we're important founding members at the start of the epidemic, the HIV epidemic as well. A little bit about me, I'm a tiny house enthusiast with a dream of being self-sufficient. And to contrast, I've just bought property in Gippsland, so not tiny houses, so go figure, but I'm really looking at embarking on that journey post-COVID. I feel really privileged to be talking today, and if there are any insights or tips that I can pass on because of my work, working with amazing LGBTI volunteers, then I'm keen to share that, and thanks to Sarah and VV for the opportunity.
No, that's great. And before we pressed record on this, we were talking about your place in Gippsland, and it just sounds like an absolute dream for someone who's currently not able to go more than 5 kilometres outside of my city house.
COVID's got to be good for something, so I thought, what else to do but buy a property? Yeah.
Absolutely, that's great.
Absolutely. So another thing I like to do before we again get into the nitty gritty is I do like to hear how people get into volunteer management, because as we know, it's not a linear pathway, and I think it's something we often stumble on. So I'm always keen to hear people's origin stories, like in superhero movies. So Daniel, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you discovered volunteer management?
Sure, look, and I think actually listening to past webinars, this has been my most favourite part of listening to the presenters and finding the backstories. So I think like many of them, I kind of landed in volunteering space after leaving corporate work and kind of reassessing what I wanted to do. And I found myself actually working in op shops for Vinnies, and I'd previously worked in retail when I was much younger. So I looked after stores for Kew and Hampton, some of their flagship centres, and then went on to be an area manager in regional areas where most of the managers in regional centres were all volunteers. So I found it quite amazing to be able to work for, alongside and with volunteers, and just kind of witness firsthand the benefits that volunteers get from engaging with organisations and community work, but also the amazing work they do in communities. And although maybe my values aligned with the organisations I was working for, I'm not a person of faith, and so I wanted to find my own tribe. So certainly taking on a role at Thorne Harbour kind of was like coming home. And I'd been volunteering for Thorne Harbour and took an opportunity working in a newly established rapid testing HIV centre, and from then kind of set my sights on wanting to be the volunteer coordinator. So certainly feel like I'm in my dream role, and very proud to lead the volunteers that we have.
Fantastic. That's so wonderful. Ada, do you want to share your story?
I'd love to, and thanks for sharing yours, Daniel. How fascinating. So I first became involved as a volunteer probably age 17 or so, and I spent the next, 15 years or so volunteering for a whole range of different organizations, formally and informally. And I found that volunteering really added to my personal experience studying and working and beyond. And it was when I was in at university that I started to get involved with clubs, with a local co-op running at my university, and started to get involved in community organising. And this has become largely the focus of my career to date, community health and community organisations. So I continued to be involved in running events, running conferences as a volunteer, and then found how much I loved working with other people and how effective volunteering was in bringing people together, creating communities and creating positive change. So then I started to take on volunteer support roles, and then bringing my way up to volunteer management and program management roles. So I started doing this at La Trobe University, for example, with the student union. I was running the clubs department, and then I moved on to running their volunteer program. And then through my experience volunteering with the LGBTI community over the years, and I should note that volunteering is a huge strength of our community for decades. I found that I really loved working within my LGBTIQ plus community, and actually was able to volunteer with Thorne Harbour with Daniel briefly as my volunteer manager. So I was able to mix my skills in volunteer management, my passion for working in community development, and being part of and loving my LGBTIQA plus community to get my job where I've been today at Switchboard for 3 years, supporting our 65 volunteers in the Out and About program, but also working larger with our organisation with about 150 volunteers, all of whom identify as part of the LGBTIQ plus community, with some allies there as well.
Fantastic and great. I love how interconnected and supportive our sector is. And so I think it's fantastic that you crossed over with Daniel as a volunteer. I think it just goes to show that a lot of people in our sector really live their values, and that's such an important thing.
Thanks for that flashback, Ada.
Thanks for being a great volunteer manager.
Oh, all the love this morning. So before we get into our discussion, we thought it would just be useful for those online who are maybe less familiar with the LGBTIQ plus community to give a bit of background for what we're talking about specifically, and how you maybe talk about this community. It's worth noting that we've already had 2 different acronyms, so the LGBTIQ plus and the LGBTIQA plus community. So I'll throw it over to you, Daniel, to start breaking it down.
Yeah, look, and thanks, Ada, for putting this together as well. I think it's a really useful one to break down what can otherwise sometimes be, a difficult acronym for people to remember or get the letters right, which in the end, I suppose, is not as important as maybe understanding a little bit about it. And also just to acknowledge that there's different versions that might be used in different regions, but even within organisations. And before coming on, Ada and I and Sarah were kind of joking at Thorne Harbour, we use a more traditional LGBTI, and certainly within the community, there's been more of a shift towards LGBTIQ and involving the word queer, which is really important. Certainly in the community, we've reclaimed that word. But for a lot of maybe sometimes our older community members or volunteers, there might be a connection with that as being a very derogatory term. So it's worth kind of acknowledging that as well. But yeah, so there's different uses of the word as well. Ada, you might want to chirp in with more information about this as well.
Sure, thanks, Daniel. And I put together this slide because I really wanted to break down that LGBTIQA+, or whatever acronym you're using, we're a really diverse group. And you can see that lesbian, gay, bisexual here refers to sexuality, transgender diverse refers to gender identity, intersex is physical sex characteristics. So intersex people are born with physical sex characteristics that don't fit medical and social norms for female or male bodies. And queer, or the plus, can mean everything else and beyond. And what's quite a key point here is that although all of us are different, we're united in our shared experience of historic discrimination, stigma, discrimination, bias, etc. And also that someone can be a combination of more than one of these things. So for example, you could be lesbian, trans and intersex, you could be gay and gender diverse, And we're again talking about, you know, a beautifully diverse community where we can use more than one label or none of the above labels, etc. And as Daniel mentioned, language has really changed over time. So at Switchboard, we often use LGBTIQA+, and the A there is for asexual, for people who are not sexually attracted to anyone. With my work with older people, as Daniel said, I often don't include the word queer because it can be quite stigmatizing for older people, used as a slur. But as a younger person, I often use the word queer for myself as shorthand. But lastly, I often recommend using if you're not from the LGBTI community yourself, you can just use LGBTI as a general phrase, or you could use the language of the people that you're speaking with. So when I work with people in their 80s and their 90s, for example, who are part of the community, they might refer to the gay community, meaning LGBTIQ+, and I just use that phrasing mirroring them.
Fantastic. That is such a clear breakdown of the different terms and some of the different ways in which that's changed over time. And I know someone's popped in the chat to say, thank you, that's a really, really great explanation. So really acknowledge Ada for putting together that really clear breakdown. While we're on definitions, we often talk about the notion of diversity and inclusion, but I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about how you guys define diversity and inclusion, and I guess why they are very, very important in the context of volunteering. So we'll go to you, Ada, first.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. I guess I'd like to really note that, of course, LGBTIQ+ is just one facet of diversity and inclusion in our society, and that certainly LGBTIQ+ people can also be people who speak English as an additional language, can also live with disability, etc. And that in our community, you know, some parts of the LGBTIQ+ acronym are more well represented than others, so there's real diversity within that acronym as well. I would define diversity and inclusion as inviting everyone to the table. That's diversity, having a range of people there, and inclusion and making sure that everybody can get there. We know that, you know, all volunteers would like the same outcomes, such as the ability to be involved in a volunteering program, but the process of how they get there can look different. So for example, as a queer or bisexual woman, I have needs that others might not have as a volunteer, and that includes, for example, people not presuming that I'm straight, or not being homophobic in the selection process, etc. So again, looking for the same outcomes in that diversity, but in that inclusion, but maybe having different process and needs and how you get there.
Absolutely. We'll throw to you, Daniel. And I think there are some really, really beautiful metaphors, some of which are on screen, but you touched on about like having a seat at the table, having a voice. There are lots of really great ways you can paint the picture between diversity and inclusion. But Daniel, I'll throw to you.
Yeah, I think if I think about a lot of volunteer involving organisations that I know, diversity and inclusion is kind of written into their business and how they deliver their services, and probably their organisational values as well. So I just think as an extension, therefore, it's important that that applies to how volunteers are engaged within the organisation as well, and not just separately for clients or how they do business. I suppose diversity is the thing we should strive for, and inclusion is how we get there, in kind of defining it, or inclusion is the behaviour and diversity is the fact. And sometimes we might, you know, think of examples where in an effort to meet diversity, people have been kind of plucked and put into roles and with all good intentions, but if there's not that culture or inclusion, then normally it kind of falls over or makes it very difficult for the next person coming through. There was a recent 1+1 interview for anyone who's an ABC fan like myself, and I just took a quote from that there, and it was a really great interview for anyone who's interested to look up on iView, and Sam Moston, and it was largely focused on diversity and inclusion as well. But I think maybe true inclusion can deliver a strong sense of belonging for volunteers, and also we know that now we're looking at measuring volunteerism through impact, and I think, you know, true diversity and inclusion means that a volunteer can have more impact in their role because they're bringing their authentic self to the role.
Absolutely. And I think when we, reflect on some of the reasons that people do volunteer, to make social connections, to, be part of a community, that feeling of belonging and fostering that is so, so critical. So I guess following on from this, we often have to, prosecute the case for some of our focuses as volunteer managers. So I guess wanted to touch on, ask you both to talk about why it's important for organised to really care and prioritise supporting diverse sexual and gender identities specifically at their organisations. And I'll go to you first, Daniel.
Yeah, so I think the other thing to consider with this about why it's so important is if we're not actively being inclusive of LGBTI people, then it means that people are being excluded. And when we think about, as Ada mentioned, really diversity inclusion, there's a lot of other groups that should be included with that focus as well. And sometimes there might be a focus on the organisation for one particular area, and LGBTI people sometimes are left out of that equation, and that may be for very different reasons, but just to maybe consider that it's important to include LGBTI people in that general push for inclusion and diversity. I say this all the time, but LGBTI volunteers are certainly, I think, an untapped resource, and I know I'm totally biased, but if I'm saying about why it's important, it's important for your business as well, because you can actually get great volunteers. And also, I think there's another aspect because of that marginalised nature, that there is sometimes LGBTI volunteers can really bring that lived experience. And also just that empathy, which may be really important to some of the volunteer roles that you might be recruiting for. That I think that's another important point there as well.
Absolutely. And, I think your point that you highlighted, that just if you aren't actually actively focusing on it, sometimes you can have a totally, homogenous program without completely realising about it, is a really good starting point for reflection. Yeah, I'll throw to you, Ada. Ada.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that inclusion is more than icing on the cake in terms of running our volunteer programs, but instead it's core business. So it's a key part of the ingredient in making a beautiful cake that everyone can enjoy. I think I'm making myself hungry with this metaphor. Also, from a statistics level, we know that at least 10% of the Australian population is LGBTIQ+. So if you're looking to expand and grow your volunteer program, just in terms of a numbers game, making sure that your volunteering program is inclusive to LGBTIQ+ people means that you're more likely to encourage and grow your volunteer program and recruit more volunteers. And this LGBTI plus 10% of the population, according to lots of research, is actually right across the lifespan. So this includes younger people as well as older people, and those living in regional and rural areas as well as those in the city. So certainly LGBTIQ plus people are everywhere, and certainly a lot of us are volunteers.
Absolutely. And yeah, we don't always just look at volunteering from a numbers perspective, but if that's the perspective that your senior management looks at volunteering, throw that statistic out there at them. So now that we've set the scene a little bit in terms of some definitions, wanted to talk, I guess, about, for those particularly who don't maybe or are a little less familiar, about some of the barriers that exist for LGBTIQ plus people when going out to volunteer. So I might throw to you, Daniel, as sort of the architect behind this wonderful image we have represented on our screen.
Thanks, Sarah. And look, this was just a really little snapshot of some of the comments that were made around a pool of volunteers talking about bringing, themselves to the volunteer role and whether they felt comfortable or uncomfortable. And you'll see some themes there definitely around people who felt more comfortable. It was acknowledging that there was a strong emphasis on inclusion, and whether that be through training or, kind of outward media and representation. And then just to acknowledge that there's some things, you know, where a lot of LGBTI volunteers may be self-selecting out before they even join an organisation because of, if not real, maybe perceived barriers as well, which are maybe a little bit harder to counter. But just to acknowledge as well that, you know, for a lot of faith-based organisations, which is where a lot of volunteering happens, it means that there might be a few more things to overcome if you're wanting to engage and also respect LGBTI volunteers. That come through as a fairly strong theme when we're looking at the volunteers. But I think there were some really nice surprising results as well. So over 90% of our volunteers had volunteered for mainstream volunteer involving organisations. And only 10% had actually left a volunteer role because of an issue around being LGBTI or their status as an LGBTI person. So that was actually a little bit lower than I might have expected in polling the volunteers. And maybe thinking about one of the main focuses in our roles as, you know, volunteer coordinators and managers is certainly around the onboarding process and paperwork involved in that. And for a lot of LGBTI people, especially our trans and gender diverse volunteers and community members, there can be a lot of barriers that exist there. So whether that be online registration forms where they're asked to put their gender and there's only options such as male, female, and then needing to choose other as a category. And also even the police check process when it may be about having to choose a gender identity which doesn't align with your own identity. The name that you're putting forward on your volunteer application versus your ID. And for anyone who's familiar, is somebody using their dead name, which is a name which they previously used but don't use now. So that can kind of bring up a lot of things, and that's just in the initial joining phase. But it's worth maybe, you know, looking at those barriers or how that can help with the process of joining the organisation and the feeling that people get.
Absolutely, and it's something that I encourage everyone on the line who's really interested in building more inclusive program to really sit down with their volunteer life cycle and go stage by stage and think about some of the barriers that might exist. Ada, I'll throw to you.
Thanks both, and really well said there, Daniel. I think a key point here is the fact that LGBTIQ plus discrimination still exists in our society. So again, volunteer programs can be a reflection of broader society. And even though, you know, we don't have the same level of state-based discrimination as we had 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, certainly homophobia, transphobia, LGBTI phobia still exists in our society. So, you know, it wasn't until 1997, for example, that homosexuality was decriminalised across Australia. So this is very much, you know, some of the legacy of these laws are still in many people's lifetimes. So it means that our work as volunteer managers involves really thinking about and reflecting on some of those biases and systematic barriers, as Daniel so well addressed. You know, it means reflecting on the fact that stigma still does exist in our society. People are still homophobic, whether they mean to or not, and how we can best improve that in our practice together. We know that, for example, trans and gender diverse people in society face high levels of social exclusion. Intersex people in Australia today still face forced conversion therapy. So we still face problems as a community, and we still need allyship and work together with non-LGBTI people to improve inclusion and diversity. So I think just breaking that down a little bit further, one barrier that I do hear a bit from my volunteers is that often volunteers have to train staff in LGBTI inclusion. So one quite easy step that we can take on board after this discussion in relation to that is, you know, in your position as a leader, as a volunteer manager, taking on that charge to educate yourself on LGBTI topics, on pronouns, on inclusion, etc. So again, thanks so much for joining us today for that end.
Fantastic. And I've noticed a few questions are starting to come through the Q&A box, which is fantastic. So what we'll do is address those at the end of the webinar to make sure we catch them all. So keep plugging them in. But it's great to see so many people really, you know, wanting to engage with everything that Daniel and Ada have been talking about today. So, you know, without making it seem like, oh, there are so many barriers, what can you do as an organisation or volunteer programs specifically to assist in supporting these communities to feel comfortable in day-to-day volunteering, now that we've spoken about some of the barriers that exist? Ada, I'll throw to you first.
Sure, absolutely. And although there may be quite a few barriers in wider society, luckily there's so many effective and relatively easy steps that we can all do as volunteer managers in order to make sure our practice is inclusive of LGBTIQ plus people. And, you know, I put myself in this as well. Although I'm a member of the community, I certainly don't know everything about every identity. So I challenge myself to stay up to date and keep informed as well. I guess just on a general level, making sure that the practices that you already do, such as volunteer surveys, feedback, etc., do ask questions about how inclusive your services are. You know, researching best practice, and we'll link through some excellent resources at the end of this session, including Volunteer Victoria's own excellent work in this area, about what are the concrete steps you can actually do. And I guess one thing I would say is, in a position of leadership, I would encourage you to have these conversations and to lead these discussions rather than volunteers coming to you to talk about it. So, for example, you know, putting your pronouns up on your name tag, on your email signature, having rainbow flags, etc. And I just wanted to also talk about pronouns. You'll notice that in my speakers list, I've listed my name as Ada Castle with she, her pronouns. And we've also mentioned this at the start. This might be new to you. And I just wanted to just quickly explain pronouns, if I may, just in terms of inclusion and best practice. So we include pronouns here to let people know how they should refer to me. So often pronouns are she, her, or they, and this lets people know that when you refer to me, please use she pronouns. Ada went to the shops, she bought some cake, she felt very happy, and that assumptions of the pronouns someone uses can actually be really harmful and exclusive. So using the right pronouns for someone can actually be a really easy and great sign of respect and a sign of inclusion, especially of LGBTI and trans and gender diverse volunteers in particular. It also brings awareness to this topic and shows that you're an ally and that you're respectful of pronouns, including gender neutral pronouns such as they and them. Excuse the slight sidebar there. Daniel, I'll go back to you.
Yeah, great. And thanks, Ada. That works really nicely because I'll maybe follow on from that really great explanation of pronouns and talk about an example in my volunteering role outside of my paid role, where I'd suggested that we use pronouns in the sessions that we were facilitating. And although they were warm to the idea, they'd said, we've actually never had someone need to use pronouns. And I'd kind of asked, well, how would we know that? And actually in the first facilitated session where we'd introduce pronouns in the introduction and ask people to use their pronouns, we had someone who reflected to the group that it's the first time they'd ever been asked about what their pronouns were, and the first time they'd kind of been given permission in a space like this. It was a really powerful moment. And so they were able to talk about why they, them pronouns were used and were so important to them in what was a largely male-dominated space for people living with HIV. So there's a lot of power that it carries. So just by having that included is really important. And also Ada mentioned, you know, as organisations like ours, we're certainly held to a higher account in this space, and it's a continuous process of staying up to date with community and finding out information, but also being leaders in that space and starting the conversations as well. I think the biggest thing that keeps on coming up is just visibility. So, you know, whether that be lanyards, you know, don't be afraid of rainbows, just put them everywhere that you can. And these are really important indicators for people, whether it be at events, whether it be on websites, and just seeing people represented just like themselves is a really important way to break down those barriers. And a lot of these steps are just small steps. The barriers might seem immense, but actually the steps are really quite easy and simple to take. And just going back to that idea about, you know, how amazing it is to see people bring their authentic self to their roles and their interactions by some of the things that organisations and leaders in organisations can do. There's really great resources that will be at the end of this presentation, and Ada's resourced a lot of those. And I'd really encourage you to look at those resources because they've got, you know, a lot bigger list than we're probably mentioning or detailing here on the slides, but with some really creative ideas as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. So we've got quite a lot of questions coming through, and some of them are, in fact, about language. Now, they might not cover all of the questions that you've popped in the chat, so we will definitely cover some of the questions at the end. But I guess I wanted to ask you both, and we have already talked about language today, but how does language play a role in encouraging diversity? And Daniel, I'll throw to you first.
Yeah, look, we focus on this a lot in any of the training we do internally as well, because whether we're talking, about LGBTI or in our case with our organisation around HIV, language is really powerful in the way that messages it can convey. So, I mean, certainly it can convey, an understanding and a level of acceptance or awareness just by the language that we're using before someone even joins the organisation. But also how it can also reflect maybe the assumptions that we're making about someone, which can have a really big impact on people. So just to be really mindful and purposeful in the language that we're using, and not using assumptions would be really important. Supportive and inclusive language reflects an inclusive culture. So just by kind of flagging that, you've almost given people the idea that there's an inclusive culture behind that at the organisation as well.
Fantastic. Ada, did you want to elaborate?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I think this again speaks to language being really powerful, but a really easy and fast and in fact free tool to show your inclusion to LGBTIQ plus people and beyond. The use of correct language can really say a lot about you as a volunteer manager and your organisation. For example, swapping terms such as good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to good afternoon, everybody is more inclusive for our community. Not making assumptions that everyone is married, for example, and referring to, for me, for example, referring to me having a husband, making that assumption, just changing that language to be more open and inclusive. And as an LGBTI person, volunteer and volunteer manager, I can tell you that our community really listens for those cues. But at the same time, it's really okay to say the wrong thing, as long as you're respectful and quick to correct yourself. If you use the wrong pronoun, for example, you can just quickly correct yourself, say, oh, sorry, I mean he, and move on. So again, it's about, trying your best, but at the same time, not beating yourself up too much if you say the wrong language, given that it does change relatively quickly. But again, committing to, wonderful opportunities such as this to stay up to date with the best language to use, the most inclusive terms, etc.
Fantastic. And I think it is a really important reminder, because you don't want your fear of getting a pronoun wrong to mean that you don't engage with someone who might use they pronouns at all for fear of forgetting to use they, because I imagine that would be a far less inclusive experience. But again, it's about that quick to self-correct and really about being willing to reflect and engage.
Or even just ask someone what they need.
And I was just going to add on to that. I think that is really important. And the idea, that when we're talking about language, I think LGBTI volunteers are really responsive when they see organisations trying in an area. So even if they haven't got it right, fully right, actually the idea that organisations are making moves or headways is received really well. So don't put it off by trying to perfect it and get it right all the time. Just making that move is a really important one.
Fantastic. So we've talked a little bit about it further, but wanting to touch on, I guess, this notion of intersectionality. And while you guys support a diverse section of the population, as you've kind of alluded to before, there's obviously diversity within the LGBTIQ plus group. And I guess, how can you talk a little bit about some of the diversity that you're trying to foster within both of your organisations? So Ada, we'll go to you first.
Sure thing, thank you. So the fact that I'm bisexual is just one part of my identity. I'm also a woman. I'm also someone who lives in a metro region. I'm someone who loves gardening, etc. So as a volunteer manager, I'd like you to notice that, that's just one part of me, but also paying attention to ways in which parts of that could be excluded or accidentally left out, such as, for example, as a bisexual person, I sometimes feel excluded in gay spaces only in LGBTI communities, as bisexuality is not as well accepted, or in some LGBTI spaces, mostly aimed at for men, I can be excluded as a woman. As a volunteer manager, it's something that I really try hard to do to make sure that my volunteers who are LGBTI, who are also people of colour, for example, don't experience racism in their work, or people with disability, for example, have access requirements, and that I'm very much aware of and meeting those access requirements.
Fantastic. Daniel, did you want to talk a little bit about
Yeah, absolutely. So with this one, I think it's important for organisations like ours who may not give a second thought to LGBTI inclusion, for example, because we're just doing it as part of our organisation, but that we pay attention in particular to those intersections. And for us, there's been a really big focus on disability inclusion at the moment. And that's involved, we put forward the volunteer program to go under the microscope as looking at one of our program areas. And although that's a really kind of, shining a light in a really, sometimes a bit of a vulnerable position, it was actually a really interesting learning experience to go through, and also to see the wins and the gains of having LGBTI volunteers with a disability come through and be supported and kind of thrive in the environment. I think, as Ada kind of mentioned, for our organisation, we've certainly suffered, from a perception of being an organisation only for gay men, and maybe early in the epidemic, gay men taking up that space to maybe the exclusion of others. So just slowly kind of repairing the damage that might have been done early on to make sure that everyone from LGBTI communities feels comfortable to come to the organisation for our services, but also for volunteering. And so that involved quite a lot of changes which have happened slowly over the years, but really important, and more so reflected in our name change in the last couple of years as well. So the good part is our volunteer program is a larger pool than our staff. So we kind of help counteract maybe some of the diversity issues or challenges on the board and on the staff by actually having a more diverse volunteer program as well.
Fantastic. And I'm just noting that there are a bunch of different resources that are coming through in that chat. And just a side note to Ada, I'm having trouble just copying and pasting those links that you sent before. So if you have a chance, if you want to repaste those links in the chat, that would be great. So we're really near the end of our kind of planned webinar. So we will throw to questions that people have submitted, and thank you all for submitting so many questions already. But as we've been planning this, obviously there are multiple conflicting priorities going on right now. And so we did want to kind of, I guess, touch on the question of why is it so important to still prioritize this, even though we are in the middle of a global pandemic, and noting that as volunteer managers, we do often have to sell some of these ideas up to senior leadership and influence our management in order to be able to spend time on them. So Daniel, wondering if you could just give people some words of encouragement so they can be all energetic in terms of taking this priority into next week.
Great. And look, I think I've got a really optimistic viewpoint with COVID going on. I'm kind of thinking the way I see things at the moment is I feel like people are really primed and prepped for change at the moment. So if this is something that's maybe been hard to kind of get on the agenda, I feel like people are really ready and receptive to be able to make some moves in this space. So I think it's actually the best time to be able to do that. So I'm looking for any kind of silver lining at the moment. And I think, mostly community-based organisations, this is what we do. So I think it's that kind of idea of just making sure that we're walking the talk, so to speak.
Fantastic. Ada, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Yeah, thanks. Just again that, this inclusion and diversity is not something extra, but instead core business. And again, this is a great time to reflect, ask surveys for your volunteers. What are you doing well? What could you improve on, etc. And engage with some of the resources that we'll soon send through. But also noting it's also a hectic time. So can also be a great time for change as well.
Fantastic. So we're going to go through some of these questions that have come in hot and fast. So do note that, if I have allowed both Ada and Daniel to take questions on notice if necessary. We do have a lot of questions about language, as I said. So one question particularly around, I guess, that other category. So someone's asked, we've put the word self-described as an option for volunteers. Is there a better way to ask, or would this be okay? And someone else saying, how would you ask the question about other gender, aside from using other gender? Would you actually list, LGBTIQ plus, transgender, diverse, etc.? So I don't know which one of you wants to step forward into the alphabet soup abyss.
Sure, I can speak to that. So this is a great question. And again, how do we actually ask the questions in a respectful and appropriate way? First of all, I would say that don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel. There's some really great resources out there with exactly these questions about how do you answer questions respectfully. So feel free to just copy and paste from those lists. I'm doing my best to just copy and paste that myself into the Zoom chat in just a moment. And the second thing, I guess, is think about the larger context. For example, if you're asking about gender, do you actually need to ask about gender? If you're asking about sex or sexuality, is that something you need to ask? Or if you do, perhaps you could write something about why you're asking, and actually you do really affirm and support LGBTI people as part of that. And then thirdly, when you do ask, perhaps you could include some kind of feedback system so that if people think you could do it better or more inclusively, you can ask for feedback and suggestions from the people themselves about how you could most do that for your organisation.
Great. And the thing I'd probably add on, because I know the limitation for a lot of us can sometimes be systems. And so if you are looking at a new volunteer management system, I think one of the really crucial things to ask is make sure that it can handle the idea of other options or classifications or people being able to self-describe, because I think sometimes people with the best intentions may want to do this, but actually it's the system that limits us from being able to do that. And we've found that with some of the medical software that we've wanted to use for client spaces. But luckily a lot of volunteer programs I think are a little bit more adaptable. And I think one of the really good resources that Ada's listed in the chat, which is from the Commissioner for Gender and Sexuality, actually has a really great section on there about how to ask someone's gender identity and even put in within forms as well.
Fantastic. So following along, really great segue, Daniel, acknowledging sisters. We have a specific one about police checks. So when police checks are required and we use an external provider for those, how can we address some of the barriers, around things like limited options, or when applicants may be required to use their dead names, or conform to male or female? Do you have a recommended provider? Do you have any, I guess, workarounds?
Yeah, and look, Megan, this is a really great question, because I think what we've found, and it's all kind of for us in the framing, so just making sure that, acknowledging that there may be some things coming up, some trigger points for people going through the process. So more so just kind of creating that really comfortable environment. And if, for example, gender identity, I think within a lot of the software that we might be using, which might be the cheaper one on the market, is very limited, acknowledging that up front and then kind of just putting that this is the software we're using. Unfortunately, this is not available. So it just kind of flags it so that when they get to that point, it's, it doesn't reflect on the organisation maybe as much, but also then the support that can be offered through there around maybe the name not matching that was given on the registration versus the identification, knowing that people feel that it will be comfortably handled, securely and privately when they're sending ID through, that maybe they don't use, generally in the community, but they have to be able to volunteer with the organisation. So I think just creating that really safe space for people, you know, knowing that this can be a really fraught area for a lot of people.
Fantastic. Did you have anything further you wanted to add to that, Ada?
Yeah, at my organisation, we do police checks as well as standard as part of our work within the community visitor scheme. And this can be quite a fraught space for everyone. So I think, just as Danielle said, just being very careful to talk about privacy and confidentiality. So for example, if someone does have to submit resources that reflect a name or gender markings that they don't currently use, put that in advance in your information about police checks. So, you know, say something like, we support volunteers who are part of the LGBTI community, who are transgender diverse. If your documents may use a different name or gender than currently used, please note we'll keep this in the utmost confidence and this data will be kept between us. But also know that some of the history of our community in Australia, that there is still people today living with criminal records from consensual gay sex. So you can apply to get this scrubbed off your record, but some of your volunteers, for example, might have, you know, previous jail time or an arrest for consensual homosexual sex in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whenever it is, given that decriminalisation only happened relatively recently. So do note that, you know, incarceration, policing, etc., is an ongoing tricky conversation for our community. So that, you know, discretion and support around police checks and the like is really, really recommended.
Ada, I'm really glad you mentioned that because it's a really important one. And for those maybe not within community, that may be a bit of a surprise. And that's another reason why framing the conversation around police checks. And I know, you know, from our organisation's point of view, we always talk about police checks being an important part of the process, but it doesn't automatically preclude you from volunteering. It just starts a conversation. So in case something like that comes up, we can then have a conversation about it and knowing that it won't prevent you from volunteering, and we can go through, you know, how to expunge that. But I'm really glad you mentioned that, Ada.
Fantastic. So we'll move on to another question from Megan. Whether there are any copyright issues with using the pride flag on our organisational website, and where can we source the correct one without doing a Google image search and risking copyright issues?
Well, this is a really interesting one because I don't know the answer to it, and I think we're in breach if that's the case. But I think the most important thing I'd probably say on it is just making sure you get the flag up the right way, and making sure we're using it correctly. But to my knowledge, unless you know differently, Ada, I don't believe there is a copyright, but there's an interesting story to the origins of the flag.
Yes, it's quite an interesting read to read about the rainbow flag and how that came apart. I wonder if this question also comes in this discussion around Uncle Harold Thomas's Aboriginal flag, which recently has had some copyright issues. For a bit of a backstory there, to my knowledge, you can use liberally and we encourage you to use liberally the rainbow flag, but also the trans and gender diverse and intersex flag if you like, and you can see some examples on both Thorne, Harbour and Switchboard's website. But again, speaking to the different experiences and knowledge and practices within our community, Daniel mentioned using the pride flag the right way around. I didn't even know there was a right way around. So again, it speaks to different practices, and, you know, as long as you're putting our image out there and really showing that you are inclusive and with that that intention behind it, you're absolutely ahead in the meantime.
Fantastic, but I will definitely go back and, you know, if I have any friends in copyright law, go and ask, because I am genuinely curious now. So thanks for an awesome question, Megan. Following on from that, Kerry-Ann has actually asked whether we should aim to undertake the Rainbow Tick accreditation program before adding the rainbow to their organisation. Oh.
Yeah, I would probably just maybe say, I mean, it's obviously a very personal decision for an organisation about whether they do the rainbow tick. But I think in regards to putting the rainbow flag, absolutely not having to do that first before using the rainbow. I think it's important to flag it. And the other thing that I would probably say, just adding on from Ada's point, that there's obviously other flags, and you'll see if you really want to wow or kind of, you know, grab the attention of LGBTI volunteers, is actually there's a combination of the rainbow flag, which combines the trans flag and also Indigenous colours, which is a really nice way of kind of bringing some of that together. And that's being used more widely in the LGBTI space as well.
Fantastic, and apologies for the slight challenge I just had with my own slides in the background. And I encourage you, Ada, before we were chatting, when we were just chatting, had a really beautiful background with multiple versions of the flag and represented in a beautiful heart. So there's great ways that you can actually represent this in your organisation. One about
Sorry to interrupt you there. Can I just speak to the rainbow tick question as well?
Absolutely, sorry.
No worries at all. Great question. The rainbow tick can be quite a large undertaking, so just bear that in mind, that it can be quite a lengthy and pricey process. However, it's a really fantastic way to ensure that your service, your organisation, your programs are culturally sensitive and culturally safe for LGBTI people. However, if you don't want to go down the line of doing the whole rainbow tick, or you're not able to, given funding constraints, etc., there's a lot of really amazing free self-audit tools and free steps and suggestions of what are the nitty-gritty details of how you can make your organization more LGBTIQ plus inclusive, and what kind of training you can access, free, paid, discounted, otherwise. There's a lot of options out there.
Fantastic. And given there has been so much interest and so many resources that have been shared today, I will do a special email as well as encouraging you to grab them off the chat as well. So I will do a special email to everyone who's been online today, just to send those resources as far and as wide as possible. So we have had a question just about your volunteer programs. But what numbers of volunteers do you manage within both of your programs? Ada, do you want to just talk quickly first, and then Daniel?
Sure, I personally manage 65 volunteers, and there's 150 volunteers in total at Switchboard.
Daniel?
Great, yeah, Ada and I love talking about our volunteer programs. So we've got 900 in total, but that includes a lot of event volunteers who join us for maybe one significant event through the year and then come back. And we have a kind of core group of about 250 to 300 volunteers who are involved in direct services with the community, which is how we started in response to HIV. So community support for people living with HIV, any professional capacities, but then also support roles within the organisation across our 5 sites.
Fantastic. And then there's just one other question. And Ricky, thank you for joining us from South Australia. Have there been efforts made in Victoria to raise awareness of what the rainbow tick is for both the general population, but also for members of the LGBTIQA plus community?
So I think about what it's for kind of speaks to one of the questions mentioned in the chat box, which talks about, of course, sometimes using symbols of LGBTI inclusive just by itself can seem a little tokenistic, and we're actually talking about larger organization, staff, and social change. So again, combining use of, showing that you are inclusive, combined with, engaging with training and resources, etc., just like everyone is today, is the winning combination that I would recommend.
Fantastic. So I think that brings us to the end of most of the questions. So please hurriedly type if you feel your question has been missed or glossed over. There have been lots and lots of resources shared, so I'm getting a little overwhelmed with the chat messages. I did also want to flag, someone has asked about the We Volunteer program announcement that has been recently made by the Victorian government. In the interest of the longevity of this webinar, because I really hope that it will be a resource into the future for volunteering Victoria and people who are interested, I'm happy for you to contact me afterwards with questions about that We Volunteer program, and there is more information available on the Volunteering Victoria website. So one more question. Ada, specifically for you, is there currently a requirement need for more volunteers to join the Community Visitor Scheme? Is there a minimum commitment time required to become a volunteer? You might have just grabbed yourself some new interested parties.
Thank you. And we're so lucky in the LGBTIQ plus community to have such strength and support from our community. As a community, we've had so many years of supporting ourselves and our communities, our families, sometimes outside of the state. So there's a lot of strength and knowledge there. Thank you so much for your question. We're currently putting out opportunities to volunteer on our website, switchboard.org.au, and I'm sure that Thorne Harbour does the same, so you can find out more information there about current opportunities.
Fantastic. So I think that is everyone. And again, thank you to everyone who's, it's been such a vibrant chat today with lots of people sharing resources, thoughts, reflections, and, really sharing their experience, which just makes this such a richer experience and makes it really feel like we are all together in the same room having a dialogue, even though we are behind our own computer screens. So I really want to thank Daniel and Ada for their time, their expertise, their sharing personally. I really couldn't have asked for two better presenters on this subject, so thank you so much. And thank you all for your questions, and I hope everyone has a wonderful, wonderful Thursday.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ada.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Have a wonderful day.